Jalen Carter stood in the dimly lit parking lot, his chest rising and falling in steady breaths as the cool night air wrapped around him. Around him, 3 bikers groaned on the pavement, their motorcycles tipped over like fallen dominoes. The fourth man, their leader, stumbled back, his face twisted in pain, clutching his ribs where Jalen had struck him with precise force. But it wasn't fear in the man's eyes. It was rage, raw and simmering. He wiped a smear of blood from his mouth, then pointed a trembling finger at Jalen. "You messed with the wrong people, boy," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "This ain't over." Jalen didn't flinch. He knew this wasn't just about a fight, it was about something deeper, uglier. The weight of those words settled on his shoulders like a storm cloud, and for the first time, he wondered, had he just made things worse? Had defending himself put his family in danger? Before we dive into Jalen's story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe in standing up against injustice, hit like and subscribe to see more powerful stories like this. Earlier that evening, Jalen Carter had no idea his night would take such a drastic turn. He stood outside a small roadside diner in a quiet Mississippi town, the neon lights flickering above the entrance, casting a dull glow on the near-empty parking lot. His 12-year-old sister, Maya, sat on the curb beside him, kicking at the gravel with her sneakers, humming the tune of a song stuck in her head. She had just finished her soccer game, and their mother, who worked the night shift at the hospital, had asked Jalen to walk her home since their usual ride had fallen through. It wasn't a long walk, maybe 15 minutes, but it was late, and their mother never liked them being out alone at night. Jalen, dressed in his usual gray hoodie and black joggers, leaned against the lamppost, scrolling through his phone, keeping an eye on the road. The night was peaceful, the only sounds being the occasional car passing by and the distant murmur of laughter from inside the diner. Everything seemed normal. Then came the sound of approaching motorcycles, a low, rumbling growl that grew louder. By the second, Jalen barely glanced up at first. It wasn't unusual for bikers to pass through town, especially on a Saturday night. But when the motorcycles didn't keep going and instead slowed down, pulling into the diner's parking lot, something in his gut twisted. The 4 men who got off their bikes weren't just stopping for coffee. They moved with a deliberate slowness, their leather jackets creaking as they adjusted them, their boots hitting the asphalt with heavy thuds. Each jacket bore the same patch, a red and white insignia with a skull in the center, and words embroidered beneath it that Jalen couldn't quite make out. One of the men, a broad-shouldered guy with a deep scar running down his jawline, scanned the area before locking eyes on Jalen. A smirk crept across his face. Jalen immediately felt the weight of their stares. His grip on his phone tightened, but he kept his posture relaxed. He knew better than to look rattled. Maya, unaware of the shift in the air, continued humming, but she must have sensed her brother's sudden stiffness because she stopped and glanced up at him. "What's wrong?" she asked quietly. "Nothing," Jalen muttered, but his eyes flicked to the bikers as they strolled closer. The scarred man led the way, his hands tucked into his pockets, the others fanning out behind him like a pack of wolves closing in on prey. When they stopped a few feet away, Jalen's heart picked up speed, but he kept his expression neutral. "Well, look what we got here," the leader said, his voice dripping with something Jalen didn't like. "2 strays hanging around where they don't belong." Jalen didn't respond right away. He knew guys like this. They weren't just looking to pass the time, they were looking for trouble. He could see it in the way they carried themselves, in the way their eyes lingered a little too long. He chose his words carefully. "We're just waiting on our ride," he said, keeping his tone even. "We'll be gone soon." The man chuckled, exchanging a glance with his friends. "That so?" He took a slow step closer, the scent of cheap beer and tobacco clinging to his clothes. "'Cause from where I'm standing, it don't seem like you got a ride coming. Maybe you ought to start walking." Jalen felt Maya shift beside him, her fingers gripping the edge of her hoodie. He could tell she was getting nervous. He didn't like that. He didn't like that these men were trying to intimidate them, trying to make them feel small. But he had learned long ago that reacting too quickly, too emotionally, could make things worse. "We're fine right here," Jalen said, his voice firm but not aggressive. The leader's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before it twisted into something darker. One of the other bikers, a shorter man with tattoos snaking up his arms, took a step forward and nudged Jalen's foot with the toe of his boot. "Got a smart mouth, huh?" Jalen didn't move. He kept his gaze locked on the leader. "We don't want any trouble," he said. "Then maybe you should take, my advice and get moving," the man said, his tone now sharper. "Unless you're looking for trouble." The implied threat hung in the air like smoke. Jalen's stomach coiled tight, but he didn't break eye contact. He had been in situations before where people had tried to push him around, where they had seen the color of his skin and made assumptions, but this was different. There was something deeper in these men's eyes, something that told him they didn't just want to scare him. They wanted him to react. They wanted an excuse. Maya, still gripping his sleeve, whispered, "Jalen, let's just go." He wanted to, he really did. But something about the way they were looking at Maya, the way their presence felt like a shadow stretching over them, made him hesitate. If they left now, would these men follow? Would they corner them somewhere with no one around to see? His silence seemed to amuse the leader, who let out a low chuckle before looking at his crew. "You see this? Boy thinks he's got a choice." Then in one sudden motion, he reached out and slapped Jalen's phone from his hand, sending it clattering onto the pavement. Maya gasped. Jalen's muscles tensed, his pulse pounding in his ears. The leader tilted his head, eyes glinting with amusement. "Guess you won't be calling for that ride after all," he said. Jalen exhaled slowly. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the instincts drilled into him from years of training urging him to act, to push back. But he forced himself to remain still, to think. The bikers were waiting for him to retaliate. They wanted to provoke him. They wanted to say they were justified in whatever came next. He wasn't going to give them that. Not yet. Instead, he bent down slowly, never breaking eye contact, and picked up his phone. The screen was cracked, a jagged line running across it. He clenched his jaw but didn't react. The leader made a tisk sound, shaking his head. "Shame. These things ain't cheap." Another biker, the one with the tattoos, let out a low laugh. Maybe if he asked real nice, we'd help him pay for a new one. The implication sent a fresh wave of anger through Jalen, but before he could say anything, Maya took a shaky step forward, her small voice cutting through the tension. "Leave us alone," she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. The men turned to her, their expressions shifting. The leader's smirk widened, but his eyes were cold. "Well, ain't you got some fire?" he mused. "Maybe we oughta teach you some respect, too." That did it. Jalen's hands curled into fists, his body coiled like a spring. The moment he had been trying to avoid was here, and he had no choice but to face it head-on. Jalen felt the world around him slow as the leader of the bikers took another step forward, his boots scraping against the asphalt, his gaze flicking from Jalen to Maya with a twisted amusement that sent a surge of protectiveness through Jalen's veins. He didn't move, not yet, but every muscle in his body was taut, his breath steady, his stance firm. Years of karate training had drilled into him the importance of patience, of waiting for the right moment to act. But right now, patience felt like the hardest thing in the world. The leader chuckled, clearly enjoying the way Jalen tensed. "Ain't nobody here to save you, kid," he said, his voice laced with mock sympathy. "So why don't you and your little sister take that walk I suggested before things get messy?" Jalen didn't flinch. He knew that if they turned their backs now, these men would see it as weakness, an invitation for something worse. So he stayed planted, meeting the leader's gaze with quiet defiance. That only seemed to amuse him more. "Think you're tough?" the man mused, tilting his head. Then, faster than expected, he shoved Jalen hard. Jalen staggered back a step, barely catching himself before falling. Maya let out a startled yelp, her fingers tightening around his sleeve. The bikers laughed, the sound sharp and grating against the night air. "Ah, look at him." One of the others sneered. "He's scared." Jalen wasn't scared, he was angry. But he also knew the second he fought back, the second he gave them what they wanted, things would spiral. So he inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay calm, even as the leader's smirk widened at his silence. No words, huh? The man reached forward, grabbing a fistful of Jalen's hoodie, yanking him closer. The stench of beer and tobacco hit Jalen's nose, but he didn't let his expression waver. Let me make this clear, boy, the man murmured, voice dropping low so only Jalen could hear. You don't belong here. You and your kind never did. Jalen clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. The words weren't new. He'd heard them before, sometimes subtle, sometimes blunt like this. But it didn't make them any easier to swallow. He wanted to hit back. He wanted to make this man regret every syllable. But he knew if he did, Maya would be the one left defenseless. And that wasn't an option. So instead he exhaled slowly and said, "Let go." The leader's smirk faltered. Maybe he had expected Jalen to beg, to shrink back. Instead, Jalen's voice was calm, steady, unshaken. That seemed to irritate him. What's that? The man asked mockingly, tightening his grip. Didn't quite hear you. Jalen didn't blink. I said let go. The bikers chuckled, clearly entertained. Or what? The leader taunted. You gonna hit me? Jalen didn't move, but inside, the tension in his chest coiled tighter. He could feel Maya's small, trembling presence beside him, could feel the biker's eyes on him, waiting, daring him to act. Then the leader released him only to shove him again, harder this time. Jalen stumbled backward, crashing onto the pavement. His hands scraped against the rough asphalt, a sting shooting up his arms. Maya gasped, darting to his side, her voice shaking as she whispered, Jalen? He pushed himself up slowly, his breathing even, his heart pounding. The bikers roared with laughter. Look at him. Bet he won't talk big now, one of them snickered. The leader cracked his knuckles, taking a step closer, towering over Jalen. Should have listened, boy. Now we gotta teach you a lesson. Jalen's fingers curled into fists, his pulse hammering in his ears. He knew this wasn't over, not even close. What do you think? Should Jalen fight back now, or does he need to wait for a better opportunity? Comment number 1 if you think he should stand his ground right now. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you believe in justice. But the real question is, what happens when the bikers push too far? Stay tuned to find out. Jalen remained on the ground for a brief second, feeling the rough sting of the pavement against his palms and the weight of Maya's fearful gaze pressing into him. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to retaliate, to stand up and fight. But he knew the second he did, everything would escalate beyond control. The bikers weren't just looking for a fight. They were looking to humiliate him, to prove a point, to assert dominance over someone they believed didn't belong. And the worst part? They were enjoying it. The leader sneered down at him, rolling his shoulders like a predator getting ready to pounce. Ain't so tough now, are you, boy? He drawled, his voice thick with mockery as he cracked his knuckles. The others snickered, their laughter a low, ugly sound that only made the fire in Jalen's chest burn hotter. He took a slow breath, steadying himself as he rose to his feet, forcing himself to move deliberately, not rushing, not reacting on impulse. He knew from years of training that anger was a weapon best wielded with precision, not recklessness. But patience could only go so far. The moment he stood, one of the bikers, a lanky man with tattoos winding up his arms, took a step forward and kicked Jalen's foot out from under him, sending him stumbling again. This time, Jalen caught himself before he could fall, his shoes skidding against the asphalt. But the chorus of laughter from the group only grew louder. You see that? The tattooed man jeered. Kid can't even stand straight. Jalen gritted his teeth, keeping his breath steady, keeping his movements measured, even as his heart pounded like a war drum. His mind was already calculating. Distances, angles, possibilities. If he fought back now, could he take all 4 of them? His training said yes, but reality was more complicated than that. The leader took another step closer, his eyes glinting with something dark. He reached into his leather jacket and pulled out a folded switchblade, flicking it open with a sharp snap. The blade gleamed under the dim parking lot lights. "I think we ought to remind you how things work around here," he murmured, twirling the knife between his fingers. Maya let out a choked gasp, grabbing onto Jalen's sleeve. He could feel the tremble in her fingers, the silent plea in her grip, the fear. And that was when Jalen knew he couldn't wait any longer. They weren't going to walk away. They weren't going to let him and Maya go. They wanted a response, and he was done holding back. The leader took another step forward, the blade still spinning lazily between his fingers. But before he could make his move, Jalen acted first. Fast, precise, calculated. In a single motion, he stepped inside the man's reach, grabbing his wrist with one hand and striking the pressure point near his thumb with the other. The knife clattered to the ground, and before the leader could react, Jalen twisted his arm and sent him crashing onto his knees with a sharp yelp of pain. The others barely had time to process what had just happened before Jalen released the leader's wrist and pivoted toward the tattooed man who lunged at him with a wild swing. Jalen ducked easily, moving with practiced agility, and countered with a sharp elbow to the man's ribs. A choked grunt escaped his attacker's lips as he staggered back, clutching his side. The third biker, a thick-set man with a shaved head, came in next, throwing a heavy punch meant to knock Jalen off balance. But Jalen sidestepped at the last second, using the man's momentum against him. He hooked his foot behind the biker's ankle and swept his legs out from under him, sending him sprawling onto the pavement with a hard thud. The fourth man hesitated, suddenly unsure, his confidence faltering as he watched his friends go down in less than 10 seconds. The leader, still on his knees, growled in frustration and lunged at Jalen again. But Jalen was already moving, already anticipating. He sidestepped, grabbing the man's wrist once more. But this time he used the momentum to flip him over his shoulder, slamming him onto the ground. The air left the leader's lungs in a sharp exhale, his eyes wide with disbelief. The entire fight had lasted no more than 15 seconds. Maya stood frozen, staring at her brother as if seeing him for the first time. The bikers groaned on the pavement, their arrogance shattered, their confidence reduced to nothing more than stunned silence. Jalen took a slow step back, his breathing steady, his hands relaxed at his sides. He wasn't winded. He wasn't rattled. He was in control. But just as he thought it was over, the wail of police sirens sliced through the night, growing louder, closer. Someone had called the cops, and Jalen wasn't the one who looked like the victim. The sharp wail of police sirens cut through the night air, sending a ripple of tension through the parking lot as red and blue lights flashed against the cracked pavement. Jalen's pulse pounded in his ears, but he remained still, his breathing steady, his muscles coiled, ready for whatever came next. The bikers groaned on the ground, their confidence shattered, their arrogance replaced with pain and disbelief. Maya clutched his sleeve, her small fingers trembling. And for the first time since this all started, a flicker of real fear crept into Jalen's chest. Not for himself, but for what was about to happen. The squad car screeched to a halt, the doors flying open before the engine had fully died. 2 officers emerged, their hands already resting on their holsters. The first was a burly, square-jawed man with a rigid posture, his gaze sweeping the scene with laser focus. The second was slightly shorter, older, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. But Jalen knew the second their eyes locked onto him, the way their hands tightened over their weapons, that they had already made up their minds about what they were seeing. "Get on the ground, hands behind your head." The order was sharp, slicing through the night air like a blade. Jalen didn't move. He knew that compliance meant nothing if their minds were already set. He had seen too many stories that ended badly for people who looked like him, people who had done nothing wrong, people who had simply existed in the wrong place at the wrong time. His mind raced. If he didn't move, they'd see it as defiance. If he moved too quickly, they'd see it as a threat. Either way, the outcome wasn't in his hands anymore. "Now!" the burly officer barked, drawing his gun, the barrel gleaming under the neon diner lights. Jalen clenched his jaw but slowly, deliberately lowered himself to his knees, his hands raising in surrender. Maya whimpered beside him, her eyes wide with terror. "He didn't do anything," she cried, stepping toward him. But before she could get another word out, the older officer moved forward, gripping her wrist and yanking her back. "Stay where you are," he snapped, his grip firm. Jalen's blood ran cold. "Don't touch her!" His voice rang out, sharper than he intended, but it was too late. The first officer took it as aggression, lunging forward and slamming Jalen onto the pavement, a knee pressing hard into his back. Pain exploded through his ribs as his arms were wrenched behind him, cold metal snapping around his wrists. His breath caught, but he didn't struggle. He couldn't. He knew better. The asphalt was rough against his cheek, the scent of oil, and dust filling his nose. Somewhere in the distance he could hear Maya sobbing. The bikers, still sprawled on the ground, began to recover, their groans turning into low chuckles. The leader, still cradling his ribs from where Jalen had thrown him, gave a smug grin. "See, officers?" he wheezed. "We were just minding our business when this punk jumped us." The officer pinning Jalen down didn't hesitate. "You attacked them?" Jalen couldn't believe what he was hearing. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see the leader's smug expression, the way his friends nodded in agreement, spinning the story to make him the villain. "That's a damn lie," Maya shouted, pulling against the officer holding her back. "They were the ones who started it. They broke his phone. They pushed him. He was just protecting me." "Be quiet," the officer snapped at her, his eye grip still tight. Jalen gritted his teeth, forcing his breath to stay steady, forcing himself not to react. He wanted to scream, to tell them to check the security cameras, to check his phone for the cracked screen, to listen to the fear in Maya's voice. But he knew they wouldn't. They already had their version of the story. The leader groaned, dramatically clutching his ribs. "Look, man, I don't want to press charges or nothing," he said, his voice thick with fake sympathy. "I mean, the kid's just a punk, probably doesn't know any better. But someone's got to teach him respect." Jalen's fingers curled into fists, his nails biting into his palms. Respect. The word made his stomach churn. They wanted him to kneel. They wanted him to submit. They wanted him to be small. He wouldn't give them that. The officer above him sighed, standing up slightly but keeping a hand on Jalen's shoulder. "What's your name, kid?" "Jalen Carter," he ground out. The older officer's head snapped up at that, something flickering across his face. Recognition. "Carter?" he repeated, his brows furrowing. "As in, Dr. Monique Carter?" Jalen froze. His mother. She had worked in this town for years as a nurse, treating everyone no matter who they were. Had she treated this man before? Had she saved his life? Was that the only thing that might save him now? The officer hesitated, then exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath before glancing at his partner. "We might want to think twice about this one." But the burly officer didn't budge. "Why? Kid's a threat." "He's not," the older one murmured, but it wasn't loud enough for Jalen to hear. There was a long pause. Then the sound of a phone unlocking. "Wait!" a new voice rang out, a woman's voice. Jalen barely managed to turn his head enough to see a figure stepping forward from the small crowd that had gathered outside the diner. A woman holding up her phone. "Recording. I saw everything," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "And I have it all on video." Silence. The bikers stiffened. The officers exchanged glances. The leader cursed under his breath. The burly officer narrowed his eyes. "You need to put that phone down, ma'am." "No," she said firmly, gripping the device tighter. "I know how this goes, and I'm not letting this kid get blamed for something he didn't do." A beat of tension so thick it was suffocating. Then slowly, the officer's grip on Jalen's shoulder loosened. "You got footage?" the older one asked. "Everything," she confirmed, flipping her phone around to show the screen, where the video had been recording since the bikers first approached. The burly officer's face twisted with frustration. He didn't like being challenged, but he couldn't argue with video evidence. He cursed under his breath, then finally, reached down and unlocked Jalen's cuffs. Jalen sat up, rubbing his wrists, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. The leader's face was a mask of fury. He knew the tides had turned. The older officer turned to him, his expression unreadable. "You said the kid started it." The leader didn't respond. "But this footage says otherwise." The tension snapped. "You're all under arrest," the officer said. "For assault." The bikers' faces drained of color. The leader took a step back. "Now hold on, man, You lied," the officer cut him off. "And you put your hands on a minor. That's more than enough to take you in." The bikers were speechless. Jalen breathed deeply, feeling Maya's small hands grip his arm, shaking but relieved. It was over. Or at least, it should have been. But as the officers led the bikers toward the squad car, the leader twisted his head to look at Jalen, his expression no longer smug, no longer amused. It was pure hatred. "This ain't over, boy," he hissed, his voice laced with a quiet promise. Then, as he was shoved into the car, the doors slammed shut, and the sirens flared to life once more. But Jalen knew. This wasn't the last time. He'd see them. Do you think justice was served, or is there more to come? Comment number 1 if you think Jalen did the right thing by defending himself, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you believe the truth should always come out. But the real question is, what happens when those bikers come looking for revenge? Stay tuned. Jalen walked home in silence, his heartbeat still pounding in his ears as Maya clung to his arm, her small fingers digging into his sleeve like she was afraid he would disappear if she let go. The sirens had faded into the night, taking the bikers with them, but the leader's final words still echoed in Jalen's mind like a warning carved into stone. "This ain't over, boy." He knew men like that. He knew the way their hatred ran deeper than just bruised egos. They had been humiliated tonight, stripped of the power they believed they held over him, and that wasn't something they would forget. His mother had always told him that true strength wasn't about proving how tough you were, it was about knowing when to walk away. But what if walking away didn't end it? What if it only made them more determined to come after him? His knuckles were still sore from the fight, but it wasn't the pain that lingered. It was the feeling of being powerless the moment the police arrived. Even with all his training, even after dropping 3 of them to the ground in under 15 seconds, none of it had mattered once those sirens came wailing through the night. Because to the world, he wasn't a trained fighter. He wasn't a disciplined athlete. He was just a black teenager standing over a group of injured white men, and that had been enough for the police to assume the worst. He gritted his teeth, shoving those thoughts aside as he and Maya finally turned onto their street, their house standing at the end of the block, like a beacon in the dark. The porch light was on, and through the living room window, he could see the familiar silhouette of their mother pacing, her phone clutched in her hand. The moment he opened the door, she whirled toward him, her eyes scanning him from head to toe before landing on Maya, whose face was still pale with shock. "What happened?" Her voice was sharp, but there was something fragile beneath it, something that made Jalen's stomach twist with guilt. He didn't want to tell her. He didn't want her to worry. But she already knew. He could see it in the way her hands trembled, in the way her breathing had quickened. She had seen the police lights from their window. She had feared the worst. "It's handled," Jalen said carefully, keeping his voice steady. "The cops took them in." His mother's lips parted slightly like she wanted to believe him but couldn't quite let herself. "Took who in?" He hesitated, then sighed. "A group of bikers jumped us outside the diner." Her face went deathly still, but her fingers curled tighter around her phone. "Jumped you?" "I didn't start it," he said quickly, knowing exactly where her mind had gone. "They came after me first. They tried to push us around. They broke my phone. He stopped himself, forcing the anger down before it could bubble over. "I handled it." His mother exhaled sharply, pressing a hand to her forehead. "Jalen." He braced himself for the lecture, for the fear disguised as frustration, for the endless warnings about how unfair the world was and how dangerous it was to stand your ground when people were already looking for a reason to see. You as a threat, but instead she just pulled him into a tight embrace, her arms wrapping around him like she was afraid he might slip away. He stiffened at first, then slowly relaxed, his chin resting against her shoulder as he closed his eyes. "I'm proud of you," she murmured, her voice soft but firm. "But you can't fight every battle, baby. Some fights aren't won with fists." He knew that. He had always known that, but tonight there hadn't been another choice. He had done what he had to do, and he didn't regret it. What he did regret was that it had come to this at all. "It's over now," he said, though the words tasted like a lie even as they left his mouth. His mother pulled back slightly, searching his face like she could read all the thoughts he was trying to bury. "You sure about that?" Before he could answer, the house phone rang. All three of them froze. His mother shot a glance at the clock. It was well past midnight. No one called this late unless it was an emergency. She reached for the receiver, her fingers shaking slightly as she pressed it to her ear. "Hello?" Jalen watched as her expression shifted from exhaustion to something colder, something sharper. "Who is this?" A pause. Then, slowly, her lips pressed into a thin, unforgiving line. "If you ever call this house again, I will have the police trace this number and make sure you regret it." She slammed the phone down, her hands balling into fists at her sides. Jalen stared at her. "Who was it?" She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was dangerously calm. "It was them." Ice slid down Jalen's spine. "The bikers?" She nodded once, her eyes locking onto his. "They're not done." He felt Maya tense beside him, her breath hitching slightly, and without thinking, he placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. Steadying himself. What did they say? Didn't need to say much. His mother's voice was tight, clipped. It was a warning. Jalen's mind raced, scenarios flashing through his head. What did that mean? Were they coming here? Were they waiting for him at school? Were they just trying to scare him, or were they serious? "We should call the police," Maya whispered. "We should tell them they're threatening us." "And then what?" Jalen muttered. "They already think I'm the problem. You saw how quick they were to cuff me. You think they'll believe us over them?" The silence that followed was answer enough. His mother exhaled slowly, rubbing her temple. "We'll handle this," she said finally. "We'll be careful. We'll keep our heads down. And if they come near this house, I'll make sure they regret it." There was steel in her voice, an unshakable resolve that sent a flicker of reassurance through Jalen's chest. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be that simple, because these men weren't just angry, they were humiliated. And humiliated. Men were dangerous. He could feel it in his bones. This wasn't over. It wasn't even close. Jalen didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the events of the evening looping in his head like a broken record. Every punch, every shove, every word spat at him by the bikers played over and over. But it was the last thing the leader had said that stuck with him the most. "This ain't over, boy." The weight of those words coiled around his chest like a vice, and no matter how many times he told himself they were just empty threats, he knew better. He could still hear the way his mother's voice had tightened when she slammed the phone down, how her hands had curled into fists at her sides. She wasn't scared, no, she was furious. But even fury couldn't stop what was coming. The bikers had been embarrassed, beaten, and worst of all, arrested because of him. He had taken something from them, their power, their control, and he knew men like that wouldn't let it go. And if they couldn't get to him, they'd find another way to settle the score. His mind drifted to Maya. She had barely spoken after they got home, her small frame curled up on the couch, her arms wrapped around her knees as she stared at nothing. He hated that she had been dragged into this, hated that she had to see firsthand what he had always known, that no matter how much you tried to walk the right path, there would always be people waiting to shove you off it. He turned over in bed, exhaling sharply, trying to shake the unease, gnawing at his chest. But sleep never came. The next morning he went through the motions, moving on autopilot as he got dressed, as he walked into the kitchen where his mother was already up, her expression unreadable as she sipped from her coffee. Maya sat across from her, picking at her cereal, her appetite clearly gone. The air was heavy, thick with the unspoken truth that none of them wanted to acknowledge. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. "You're not going to school today," their mother finally said, breaking the silence. Jalen stiffened, his jaw tightening. "I can't just hide," he said, though part of him wanted to. "You think they'll just forget about this?" She sighed, setting her mug down with a quiet clink. "No, but you being out there makes you an easy target." "And staying in here makes me what?" he challenged. "A sitting duck? There." Mother shot him a sharp look, the exhaustion in her eyes replaced with steel. "It keeps you alive," she snapped. "Don't you get it, Jalen? They don't care that you were defending yourself. They don't care about the truth. They only care that they lost. And men like that, men who hate losing, they don't just let things go." Jalen's fists clenched under the table, frustration simmering beneath his skin. He knew she was right. He knew every word she said was the truth. But the idea of hiding, of letting them win in any way, made his stomach turn. He wasn't built to cower. He wasn't built to run. And maybe that was his problem. Maybe that was exactly why he was in this mess to begin with. The sharp buzz of his phone broke the tension. He pulled it from his pocket, his stomach twisting. The second he saw the unknown number flashing across the screen, he didn't answer, but the second it stopped ringing, a message popped up. "You think this is over? We know where you live. Watch your back, boy." His pulse thundered in his ears. His mother saw the way his expression darkened, saw the way his grip tightened around his phone. "What is it?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Jalen turned the phone around, letting her see the message for herself. Maya sucked in a sharp breath, her grip on the spoon going white-knuckled. Their mother didn't react at first, just stared at the screen, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she got up, walked to the counter, and picked up her own phone. "What are you doing?" Jalen asked, but he already knew. "Calling the police," she said. "Again. And what's that going to do?" His voice was sharper than he intended, but the frustration bubbling inside him had reached its breaking point. "You really think they're going to do anything? They barely believed us the first time. They don't have a choice now," she said simply, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Threatening messages? That's harassment, and if they lay a hand on you again, it's premeditated assault." Jalen exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. He wanted to believe that was enough. He wanted to believe the police would handle, that this would end with a few arrests and a restraining order. But deep down, he knew better. The system wasn't built for people like them. The police might act like they were on their side now, but the second those bikers started spinning a different story, things could shift. And if they came back, if they decided to take matters into their own hands, he didn't like where that thought led. His mother was still on the phone, her voice clipped and controlled as she spoke to the officer on the other end. Maya had gone silent again, her hands twisting in her lap, her expression unreadable. Jalen's chest tightened at the sight. She was just a kid. She shouldn't have to deal with this, none of them should, but this was their reality. He pushed away from the table, moving toward the front window, peeking through the blinds like he expected to see a fleet of motorcycles roaring down their street. Nothing. Yet. But it was only a matter of time. The rest of the day crawled by, in an agonizing blur. His mother kept them inside, watching the news, checking her phone every few minutes like she was waiting for something, though Jalen wasn't sure what. The police had said they'd look into it, but there was no real promise there. Just empty words. Just protocol. The sun had barely begun to set when the first sign of trouble came. The low, familiar rumble of engines. Jalen stiffened, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs as he turned toward the window. Maya tensed beside him, her small fingers clutching his sleeve. Their mother moved quickly, snatching her phone off the table, already dialing. Jalen swallowed hard, watching as 3 motorcycles slowed in front of their house, idling on the street. The riders didn't get off. They didn't make a move, they just sat there watching, waiting, a silent warning. Jalen's stomach twisted. They weren't here to fight. They were here to remind him that they could. His mother was already talking to the police, her voice calm but edged with anger. "They're outside right now. I want an officer here immediately." But Jalen already knew the truth. By the time the cops got here, they'd be gone. And next time, they wouldn't just be watching, they'd be acting. He clenched his fists at his sides, his breath coming in slow, controlled inhales. He wouldn't run. He wouldn't hide. If they thought they could scare him, they were dead wrong. Because the next time they came back, he'd be ready. More ready than they'd ever expect. Jalen's story isn't just about self-defense or standing up to a group of bikers. It's about something much deeper. The struggle for dignity, the courage to fight against oppression, and the reality of living in a world where some people believe power belongs only to them. From the moment those bikers walked into the diner's parking lot, their goal was never just to intimidate Jalen. It was to make him feel small, to remind him that in their eyes he didn't belong. They didn't expect him to fight back. They didn't expect him to win. And most of all, they didn't expect him to refuse to break. But true strength isn't about physical power alone. It's about knowing when to stand your ground and when to rise above hatred. Jalen didn't just fight for himself. He fought for his sister, for his mother, for every person who's ever been told they weren't good enough, that they should back down, that they should be afraid. He fought because he had no choice. Because in a world that often assumes the worst about people like him, he had to prove that he was more than their expectations. The real question isn't just whether Jalen won that night. It's whether the battle itself ever truly ends. Because for many people, this isn't just a story, it's reality. It's what they face every day in different forms, whether it's discrimination at school, injustice in the workplace, or fear in their own neighborhoods. And that raises an important question. What would you do if you were in Jalen's shoes? Would you fight back? Would you run? Or would you find another way to reclaim your power? Comment below and let us know. If you believe in standing up for what's right, if you believe in strength, in resilience, in justice, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more stories that matter. Thank you for watching, and remember, true power isn't about how hard you hit. It's about how strong you stand. Stay safe, stay strong, and we'll see you in the next story.